It is 7 o'clock. You're watching Sky News Breakfast. Good to see you this morning. Boris Johnson, look, I think it's fair to say he's already under a fair amount of pressure from his own MPs as the wait goes on for the publication of that report into Downing Street parties. Now it seems they also want the PM to delay a hike in national insurance. And he might well be persuaded. I'll be speaking to the Technology Minister, Chris Philp, shortly. It is Friday, the 28th of January. Hoping to break the diplomatic deadlock, talks are due between Putin and Macron over the Russia-Ukraine crisis. As the Mayor of Kyiv tells Sky News, Ukrainians are ready for any eventuality.
We have to defend our country, defend our future, defend our families. We are not aggressive, we have to defend.
Taxing times. Talk of a government rethink on raising national insurance as the rise in the cost of living continues to take hold. Aid for Afghanistan. The Foreign Office pledges nearly £100 million of emergency funding for food, healthcare and water supplies. Party on. Nightclubs in Wales reopen today as a wave of COVID restrictions on businesses are lifted. Failure to deliver, a warning of communities left isolated as new research shows post offices have been closing at the rate of 2 a week for the last 2 years. Also ahead for you this morning, sightseeing booms in Barnard Castle. And it's for more than just eye tests. We'll be speaking to English heritage after visitor numbers to the County Durham fortress soared in the last year.
Deliberately trying to scare me and intimidate me. I know what you're doing, but you're playing my game. Slow it down, break it down.
Okay.
Do it slowly.
I'll be speaking to Oscar nominee Riz Ahmed about his new short film. And as for the weather, after a mainly fine start, cloud will increase from the west, bringing rain and gales to northern Scotland. Morning all. The United States is calling on the UN Security Council to discuss the ongoing tensions on the Russia-Ukraine border. Russia has positioned 100,000 troops near that border, but denies it plans to invade its former Soviet neighbour. More talks among European leaders are due this morning, with the French President Emmanuel Macron due to speak to Russia's Vladimir Putin. Meanwhile, Ukrainians have been preparing themselves for every eventuality. The Mayor of Kyiv and former world boxing champion Vitaly Klitschko has told Sky News his citizens will defend themselves. Well, from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, sent this report.
A school in Kyiv evacuated as bomb disposal teams searched the building. A training exercise this time, but schools across Ukraine have been plagued with false alarm bomb scares, being blamed on Russian agents.
Якого брат до голови отрубать, что таке делают здесь. Это же над детьми издеваются. Ну як вот эти, что звонят, кто? Бидлы. Которые не это и не хочуть, щоб тут спокійно було на Україні. Бо їм Україна вся в этом устерчить.
The Ukrainians have obviously got to carry out these kind of drills because there could be more bomb scares. But this is doing nothing, obviously, to calm already pretty jittery nerves in the city.
In the corridors of power in the offices of the president, his advisor told me a Russian invasion isn't imminent, but Russian agents are inside the country and creating division and fear.
Безумовно, для росіян сьогоднішня ситуація виглядає дуже перспективно. Тобто вони створили, принаймні прийняли активну участь в створенні потужного інформаційного тиску на українську суспільну думку. Суспільство, безумовно, сьогодні дуже просто залякати. Воно дуже активно, навіть проактивно і чи навіть реактивно реагує на будь-які закиди з точки зору, що завтра буде війна.
To the Mayor of Kyiv from Boris Johnson.
Yeah. Across town, Kyiv's mayor and boxing champion Vitaly Klitschko showed me the book Boris Johnson gave him, The Prince, Machiavelli's manual on the dark arts of power.
Has that been useful for you as Mayor of Kyiv? Yes, of course.
Ukrainians, he says, will use everything they have to defend themselves.
We don't have another choice. We have to defend our country, defend our future, defend our families. We are not aggressive. We have to defend future of our children.
But Ukraine needs more help from allies, he says, ridiculing Germany's promise to send 5,000 helmets and questioning what side it's on.
It's joke. Germans have to decide in which side. If Ukraine defend our independence, in territorial integrity, or in the side of aggressors.
Ukrainians must watch and wait while the diplomacy goes on miles away from here. In the meantime, preparing for the worst. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News, Kyiv.
Joining us from the government this morning, the Technology Minister, Chris Philp. Minister, great to have you on the programme this morning, but clearly these are very concerning times given the troop build-up around Ukraine. President Biden has warned Ukraine's president to prepare for impact. Are we really that close to conflict, in your opinion?
Well, we're deeply concerned. The build-up of Russian troops around the Ukrainian border has reached unprecedented levels. Military units from the far east of Russia have moved into that region, something that hasn't happened for many, many years previously. So I think it is a very serious situation. I think President Biden and our Prime Minister are right to warn President Putin that the consequences, if they do invade Ukraine, will be very, very serious indeed for Russia in terms of sanctions. The Americans made clear yesterday that the Nord Stream 2 pipe would not happen if they invade. In the United Kingdom, we're doing everything we can to support the Ukrainians, including supplying military equipment that would help them, and training as well that goes with that, that would help them prevent Russian tanks from entering Ukrainian territory. So I think we are urging Russia to get to the table, to discuss issues that are relevant and to de-escalate this situation, which will ultimately, de-escalation is clearly in the interests of all concerned. It is not too late to de-escalate, and that is what now needs to happen.
Yeah, we will certainly see over the coming days and weeks the tone struck by Vladimir Putin. I do, however, want to move on to more domestic matters, Minister, given that we have you on the programme this morning. And national insurance. In various interviews this week, ministers from the Cabinet down have all insisted that planned increase come April is going to go ahead. Yesterday, the Prime Minister didn't confirm it. I'm just wondering, what is your understanding of the situation right now? Is that national insurance rise in April set in stone?
Yes, it is going ahead. It was approved by the whole Cabinet. It was passed by Parliament with a significant majority, and the money is needed to fund the NHS, which is something I think that is a national priority. It's £36 billion over 3 years to fund the NHS and social care. We need to put that money in to make sure the NHS has the resources it needs to recover after the pandemic, and this is a proportionate way of finding that money.
We are, of course, though, all of this has to be considered against the backdrop of rising energy prices, that energy price cap coming out in, just over a week's time. When are we going to hear more from the government in this? And your colleague, James Heapy, speaking on television last night, said the government is in listening mode in all of this. When are we going to hear more from the government about the financial assistance that may be made available as we head into some very, very expensive times?
Yeah. Just on the national insurance point, it's worth keeping in mind that the 6.5 million people on the lowest incomes won't pay a single extra penny as a result of that, and half of the extra money paid will be paid by the 14% of top earners. So it's just worth keeping that in mind. On your broader question about cost of living, yes, the government absolutely is in listening mode about the general broader cost of living issues. There are lots of measures in place already to help address that. I mean, the cost of living issue, by the way, is clearly a global issue. Inflation in America is higher than it is here. It's higher in Germany than it is here as well. It's a global phenomenon, but we do need to take action. So, for example, there is already a big increase in the minimum wage planned for April. It's going up to £9.50 an hour, an increase that is well above the rate of inflation. We've already announced that the universal credit taper is being extended, which will put an extra £1,000 a year into the pockets of families on lower income. And there are a huge number of interventions happening on energy prices. So, for example, there's the things like the winter fuel allowance we've had for many years. There's also a £500 million fund established already to help people on lower incomes with their fuel bills. But I suspect there will be even more done in the coming weeks and months, but in a targeted way, to make sure people who need some assistance with things like fuel bills can get that. But a lot has been done already.
I wonder if we can turn our attention to Afghanistan. You may well have heard us reporting the fact that the Foreign Office is giving an additional £100 million aid, which I'm sure those in Afghanistan will be crying out for. But yesterday, the accusation was made that the Prime Minister was ultimately responsible for signing off on the repatriation of animals over Afghans. He described that allegation yesterday as total rhubarb. What on earth did he mean by that?
Well, I think he meant that the allegation was not true. I think that's what he meant when he said.
Well, why didn't he say that?
The Prime Minister wasn't involved in. Well, I think he wasn't involved in making individual decisions. And we should also be clear, by the way, that the plane which those people and animals came out on was not a plane that was commissioned or chartered by the UK government. It was done privately by donors. But I think the Prime Minister's made his position on this very clear. It wasn't something that he was personally involved in. And we should, by the way, we should also, as a country,
I want to focus on the language, because I keep hearing that the Prime Minister is gifted in its use. I'm just wondering whether or not you think describing it as total rhubarb is respectful to the Afghan interpreters that we left behind, some of whom are now dead.
Well, I think what we should be clear about in terms of the Afghan situation is that last August, in that emergency situation, the United Kingdom evacuated far more people from Afghanistan than any other European country. We did it in very short order. We provided troops on the ground to protect that airbase in Kabul. So I think we can be extremely proud of what we did in Afghanistan. And now we're running a programme over a 5-year period that will see more at-risk Afghan civilians, including or particularly women and girls, resettled into the UK in large 20,000 people. That is more than any other European country. So the fact the United Kingdom has helped and will help more Afghans than any other European country is something we can be enormously proud of.
Yep, I understand that. But despite the fact that we have emails from the Foreign Office, letters from Boris Johnson's then PPS, the Prime Minister describes the allegation that he authorised this as total rhubarb. I'll repeat that. So if the Prime Minister didn't authorise it, who did?
Well, the Prime Minister wasn't involved in making operational decisions. The plane, as I said, was actually chartered privately. In terms of the operational decision-making about who had access to the airstrip, the airfield, and who got into the perimeter of it, I mean, those would have been operational decisions. I don't know exactly which person would have been controlling that on a day-to-day basis.
Which department, then?
The Prime Minister's been clear.
The Foreign Office, the Ministry of Defence?
Well, they were working on that together, both of those departments. But let me just be clear again. The United Kingdom evacuated more people from Afghanistan in August than any other European country, and we can be extremely proud of that.
I understand that, but if the Prime Minister is telling us, despite the evidence that we can all see with our own eyes, where he is named in an email from the Foreign Office as having authorised this, if he didn't authorise it, who did? I think it's a fairly significant question.
Well, I've explained already that those operational decisions about on the ground were being taken by teams working in the Foreign Office. Operationally, the Ministry of Defence obviously were in control with the Americans of Kabul airport. The Prime Minister's been clear that it wasn't the decision he was involved in. I think whoever wrote that email, it was obviously a sort of second or third hand account. Clearly it was mistaken. And as I say, the efforts we made in Afghanistan in August and that we're making now and over the next few years are leading Europe. And that is something we should be proud of.
Sure. Minister, I suppose the broader point in all of this is that there are legitimate concerns about the Prime Minister's capacity for telling the truth at the moment, of his moral probity. In fact, you yourself were openly mocked by the audience on BBC's Any Questions when the host asked you if Boris Johnson was a beacon of moral integrity. I mean, do you stand by that? Do you honestly believe Mr Johnson to be a beacon of moral integrity?
Yeah, yes, I do. And he's someone who is working night and day and has been since he became Prime Minister 2.5 years ago. He's delivered Brexit, which obviously people thought was difficult or impossible. He did that. He won a landslide general election victory. We've since been hit by COVID, and he and his team have been working night and day to get us through this pandemic, as a result of which we've had a European leading booster programme. We've got more payroll jobs now, 400,000 more than before the pandemic. Youth unemployment at a record low. The IMF came out this week forecasting that we would have the highest growth in this country of any G7 economy. None of that is an accident. It's happened as a result of enormous amounts of hard work that have been led by the Prime Minister. And I think the results speak louder than words, and the results the Prime Minister has delivered for this country in extraordinarily difficult circumstances are something that he and his team, the government, and frankly, all of us can be proud of.
Just finally, and very, very briefly, I do need to let you go. As of this moment, as of 7:15 on a Friday morning, the Sue Gray report has not yet been handed to Downing Street. Is that your understanding?
Well, I spoke to someone in Downing Street about half an hour ago, and they certainly didn't indicate that it had been received. So, I don't know a lot more than you do, but I've certainly got no information as of right now that it's been received. No.
Ms. Phil, thanks very much for joining us this morning. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Time for us to take a quick look at the front pages. And let's start with the Eye, which is reporting that Boris Johnson's plan to tackle the cost of living crisis is being delayed by what it calls the turmoil in Downing Street. Treasury alarmed, says The Guardian, as the Prime Minister refuses to confirm whether the national insurance rise would go ahead as planned in April. We had the Minister just a moment ago saying that it would. The Guardian, however, interpreting all this as an attempt to save his job. The Telegraph understands that the Treasury intends to close a loophole which allowed people to claim a tax credit of £125 if they work from home, even for a single day. Still to come on the programme this morning, we'll have much more on the cost of living crisis. Labour's Shadow Scotland Secretary Ian Murray on the programme as the party calls for action from Westminster and indeed Holyrood on rising inflation. 2 weeks after the devastating volcanic eruption and tsunami, we'll hear from Tonga's High Commissioner about the current situation. And I'll be speaking to the head of a charity calling for more mental health support for NHS staff. Well, the Foreign Secretary has announced a further £97 million of emergency aid to help tackle Afghanistan's humanitarian crisis. It comes after reports from Sky News that some families are selling their kidneys to pay for food. The correspondent responsible for that story, our special correspondent Alex Crawford, joins us now live from Hera. Alex, really good to see you this morning. £97 million. I mean, it's not a drop in the ocean, of course. That money will find a home, I'm sure. But the scale of the problems that you've been witnessing suggests there needs to be a degree more humanitarian intervention.
As you say, of course, people will welcome something because at the moment, millions, literally millions, are not getting anything. Out of a population of, say, around about 40 million, maybe give or take a few, almost 90%, more than 90% are not getting very much at all. And this is a country that's been pretty much wholly dependent on international aid for the best part of 2 decades. So the sudden cutting off of that aid is really hitting hard. And we're seeing on the ground the desperation. I mean, it can't really be exaggerated too much. There are children, women, men, all hungry. Almost everyone we meet, from elders to the very young and the very small, are all hungry and all begging us to help them and to find food for them. They're earning at maximum, if anything. Many families are not earning anything. And there's a real problem with getting access to aid. So even if the aid is doubled, as the British government is saying, they're doubling their aid increase, a lot of it isn't getting to the right people, and there definitely isn't enough of it.
Alex, you and the team do stay safe and well for now. Thanks very much indeed. Now, reports suggest the Prime Minister could be reconsidering the hike in national insurance as he faces pressure from some of his MPs not to raise the tax as people face a cost of living crisis. Ministers are due to meet next week to discuss the situation as many struggle to pay for essentials. Sky's Shaman Freeman-Powell reports.
To buy a loaf of bread, single mum Emma may visit 4 or 5 different shops. She learned that the only way to compete with rising food prices is to shop around for a deal.
It is quite an effort to go through it. Once you've done it a few times, you do get into swing on it and you know which place to go. Because I find that you need to find the consistent price as opposed to an offer price.
Families across the UK are facing the worst living crisis for 30 years. Millions can't even afford the basics. And single parents like Emma are even more likely to feel the pinch. Campaigner Jack Monroe took to Twitter to criticise the current model used to measure the average cost of goods, saying it doesn't reflect the impact that pricier food is having on poorer families. Lorna Cooper has been giving advice to low-income families for years now and says demand for her help has only grown.
When I first started my Facebook page, like 7 years ago, we would get people messaging and saying, I'm really struggling this month. You know, there was an expense and it was a short term. But now it's not a short term, it's every single week, every single month. People just don't have enough to fulfil their basic needs.
With bills, food and fuel costs rising, families up and down the country worry they may not be able to feed their kids. Charities say that this reality is even worse for those dependent on the state for help.
I would say to the government, you really need to increase benefits by the rate of inflation, at least the rate of inflation, because, you know, without that, single parents are just running to stay still.
But whilst waiting for those in power to help, many in Britain will find themselves falling below the breadline. Shaman Freeman-Powell, Sky News.
Some of the day's other news now, and COVID restrictions in Wales are being eased from today. Nightclubs can reopen, while social distancing and the rule of 6 have been scrapped for outdoor hospitality. Self-isolation is also being cut to 5 full days, bringing it in line with England. But masks will still be required in most indoor settings, and COVID passes needed for large events. Well, the latest UK data shows 102,292 new cases of coronavirus confirmed in the latest 24 hours. Another 346 deaths were recorded, taking the number of deaths within 28 days of a positive test to 154,702. Scientists are warning that allowing poorer countries to remain unvaccinated against coronavirus is a reckless approach to public health. A letter signed by more than 300 health experts, including members of the government's SAGE committee, says the best way to prevent new variants is to vaccinate most of the world's population. More than 200 post offices have closed in the past 2 years, the equivalent of 2 a week. Research by Citizens Advice also found half of all temporarily closed branches have been shut for more than 2 years. Let's get more on this story. Our correspondent Milena Veselinovic is in the newsroom. Morning, Milena. I mean, it's been bad for quite some time if you've been trying to find a post office, but I suppose these figures just seem to confirm that.
Morning, Neil. That's right. And there are still communities in this country who rely on the post office to carry out some pretty essential tasks, like paying the bills and sending letters. And Citizens Advice found that they're now spending a lot more time and money trying to reach a branch. More than 200 branches closed in the last 2 years. And in rural areas, 1 in 3 branches are open only about 5.5 hours a week. And this does disproportionately affect people who are older, who are disabled, disabled, those in rural communities who still use these services, because of course a lot of them have actually moved online. People are paying by direct debit, they're sending emails, but not everyone. And Citizens Advice quoted one man in their research who had a 90-minute trip to his closest post office. He could only afford to go once a week, so he would collate all of his bills and letters for that once weekly trip, but that would mean he would sometimes be late with his bills, and he got fined by utility companies. And then another woman moved away when her local branch was closed because she couldn't afford to get to the other nearest one, but the other one got closed as well. So for those people, it's a dire situation. In turn, the post office says that their branches have been stable. They say they've got 11,500 outlets across the country, and they also say that in 2019 alone, they opened 200 new ones.
Milena, thank you. Let's take a look at a few of the day's other headlines now. And a teenager has been charged with 2 counts of racially aggravated assault after 2 Jewish men were attacked outside their shop in North London. Malaki Thorpe is due to appear at Highbury Corner Magistrates Court later today. The National Cybersecurity Centre has urged UK organisations to bolster their cybersecurity amidst concern for potential Russian attacks linked to tensions with Ukraine. The warning comes as Ukraine was hit with what officials described as a massive cyber attack last week that targeted around 70 government websites. It became famous overnight after Dominic Cummings' lockdown visit, and now Barnard Castle has seen its busiest year on record. English Heritage said visitor numbers to the medieval castle were up a fifth on pre-pandemic levels. British Sign Language is set to become a recognised language in the UK. The government's due to back a bill that would improve accessibility for deaf people, including the use of sign language during public service announcements. The RSPB's annual Garden Wildlife Survey starts today. The conservation charity is asking birdwatchers to put out fresh water, clean bird feeders and a variety of food to attract different species to their gardens. Hundreds of thousands of people are expected to take part by recording how many species they spot within an hour. Welcome back. Just a reminder as to our top stories this hour. The French President Emmanuel Macron is expected to speak with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin this morning, as the US President warns there is a distinct possibility that Russia could invade Ukraine. COVID restrictions are being eased in Wales from today, with self-isolation cut to a minimum of 5 days and the relaxing of social distancing. And the Technology Minister confirmed that the national insurance tax rise is going ahead in April, as the rise in the cost of living continues to take hold. Well, let's just have a quick reminder as to what the Minister told me just a few minutes ago.
Yes, it is going ahead. It was approved by the whole Cabinet. It was passed by Parliament with a significant majority, and the money is needed to fund the NHS, which is something I think that is a national priority. It's £36 billion over 3 years to fund the NHS and social care. We need to put that money in to make sure the NHS has the resources it needs to recover after the pandemic, and this is a proportionate way of finding that money. Yes, the government absolutely is in listening mode about the general broader cost of living issues. There are lots of measures in place already to help address that. I mean, the cost of living issue, by the way, is clearly a global issue. Inflation in America is higher than it is here. It's higher in Germany than it is here as well. It's a global phenomenon, but we do need to take action.
Well, let's bring in our political correspondent, Rob Powell. Morning, Rob. So national insurance rise in April, definitely happening then, yeah?
Yeah, there's a sort of mismatch, though, between what ministers like Chris Philp are saying and even the Number 10 spokesperson who gives the regular lobby briefing, asks that straight question, gives a straight answer. Yes, it's happening. When it comes to the Prime Minister, though, he's had multiple opportunities this week where he's been asked that exact same question, and he's just not willing to be as explicit as saying, yes, that national insurance rise, 1.25% for employees, 1.25% for employers, that's due in April, is going ahead. He just says, look, we need to find the money, the NHS needs the money, but then pressed on whether that will come through NI, he just won't say yes, or can't seemingly bring himself to say yes. I think that, combined with a few well-placed anonymous quotes in some of the newspapers this week is why many are wondering whether this could be something that could either be put on hold or shelved, partly to ease cost of living. We know energy bills will be going up. That announcement's due in about 10 days on the price cap. Inflation running high. Is it politically feasible for them to be putting up taxes at that point? But also, you can't disentangle all of this from the other situation that the Prime Minister is in over the Sue Gray report, which we are still waiting for. It's still not gone to number 10 as of this morning. And this could be something, delaying this tax rise, that many of his MPs hate, that might get them on side if he did it. It would be a big call, though, and he'd probably have a fight with the Treasury if he decided to do it.
Yeah, I think so. Rob, for now, thank you. It is now 2 weeks since the volcanic eruption that triggered the tsunami that devastated parts of Tonga. Relief efforts are underway as aid from around the world has started to arrive. Tonga's High Commissioner joins us now on the programme. Titilupe Fanetu Vavau Tue Vakano. Excellency, with many, many apologies for butchering your beautiful name there. I wonder if we can start, though, with just an update of what is going on the ground in Tonga at the moment. As I understand it, some 85% of the country was affected by the tsunami.
Yes, well, thank you very much for having me and good morning. We're still very much at the recovery phase, so at this time we don't have a lot of figures on the extent of the damage caused by the eruption of the underwater volcano and the tsunami. But we do know that 85% of the population was severely affected. Communication is still very much intermittent. Transportation between the islands is a challenge. Food and water is a scarcity, although we have received humanitarian aid and supplies while trying to maintain our COVID-free status.
What level of assistance have you been getting from regional partners and indeed from countries slightly further afield?
Yes, well, we're grateful for the outpouring of the support that we've received from our partners and from people around the world. A number of our committed partners, the UK included, as well as Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Fiji, the US, India and France and others have sprung to action with the provision of humanitarian assistance and aid in the form of food, water and shelter, and also with some technical assistance as well.
What then is the priority for Tonga at the moment? We understand, of course, there are problems with the contamination of drinking water. I mean, that would strike me as one of the priorities, but you're closer to the situation on the ground. Where is the pressure most being felt currently?
So our priority needs would be food and a clean water supply, but also to re-establish the communications with the outer islands as well as abroad. Medicine would also be a priority need as a result of the volcanic eruption, where the ash still remains in most of Tonga, causing a lot of dust.
And of course, as part of the Commonwealth, Her Majesty has even sent a message to the people of Tonga. Has it perhaps been, if not surprising, then reassuring, the outpouring of international sympathy that there has been?
Yes, we were grateful to receive and to see the message from Her Majesty the Queen, and she basically had offered her support and her condolences to His Majesty the King and the people of Tonga. So we were very grateful for that.
Of course, as you say, the situation is still being appraised and there are communications difficulties on the ground. But in terms of building back from this, how confident are you that Tonga can do so, perhaps with the assistance of the international community?
Yes, as I said before, a number of our committed partners have sprung into action to help the people of Tonga with the humanitarian relief. And this will be a long road to recovery. And we hope that our partners remain with us as we seek to rebuild the nation smarter and more resilient.
Excellency, just for viewers who are not as familiar as perhaps some of us are with Tonga, and as someone who's supported rugby and played rugby a lot through his life, that was my kind of initial point of contact with the islands. Just tell us just a little bit about your home and why it is such a special place.
Well, Tonga is the only constitutional monarchy in the South Pacific, and we've survived years and years of being independent and having a foreign policy of being friends to all and enemies of none. And we've we have no winter. It's all sun, sand, and sea, and we're very welcome to tourists. And the tourism industry contributes. It makes a huge part of our industry, our economy. Yes.
Well, I have to say it is a place that I desperately want to visit at some point in the very near future. Your Excellency, thank you so much for joining us in the programme. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, the last 2 years of the COVID pandemic have taken their toll on many people, but perhaps most acutely on those who work in the health service. A recent survey of 10,000 NHS staff found that half are actively looking to leave their job, with 2/3 citing poor mental health as the main factor. Dame Claire Gerrada is the President of the Royal College of General Practitioners and Chair of Doctors in Distress. Great to see you on the programme this morning. How concerned should we be about the long-term impact on the mental health of our health practitioners?
Thank you and good morning. Listen, it's difficult to answer that because, of course, anybody that's got mental health issues because of their work is worrying, and the figures that we're seeing from the surveys, but also from a service I run for doctors with mental illness, is showing that we're seeing a staggering increase in the number of people presenting with mental health problems. And what Doctors in Distress has been doing over the pandemic is providing support groups for doctors, nurses, paramedics, in fact, for any healthcare staff. And we're actually calling on the government to fund for every single healthcare worker just 1 hour per month to help workers remain resilient, remain mentally well, by providing them with 1 hour per month for supervision, support, we can call it what we like, in order that we can actually keep people well and keep people in the workplace.
And of course, staff retention within the health service was an issue even before we went into the pandemic. I mean, when we're talking about, perhaps as many as 1 in 10 posts within the health service vacant at the moment, any further exodus of staff from the front line of the NHS really does start to put the quality of care into question.
Yes, and to be fair, the NHS has provided support for staff throughout the pandemic, and what the pandemic has done is shone a light on how important mental health and mental well-being is. But what we're asking for is that you don't have to put your hand up and say, I'm struggling, I need help, because those that need the help most are the most reluctant. We want this to be embedded within every single health worker's contract, paid for, time allocated to it, so it's there, and it becomes as normalised as, for example, I have to do continuing professional development, quite rightly, and this becomes as normalised. And yes, I mean, we've seen the pandemic has taken its toll on everybody. I think most people are feeling not as resilient and as mentally well as they were, say, before the pandemic, but healthcare staff have had to carry really quite an enormous burden of the work of keeping us all well and keeping us as safe as possible.
I mean, it strikes me that even pre-pandemic, working in the health service, working in healthcare, is probably not one of the least stressful professions. So I'm wondering, to what extent, when people are training, when people are perhaps doing their clinical part of their training, to what extent are they briefed, are they warned, are they prepared for the mental stresses of working within the health service?
It doesn't form certainly didn't form part of my training. I don't think it forms part of a medical student's training. I think there is an increased awareness, but listen, nothing can prepare you for the fear, the anxiety of actually having to deal with sick people. And it is an anxiety-provoking place to work, but that's why we train, that's why we have such a long training. But what we're calling for, just as we've had physical personal protective equipment during the pandemic, I think we now need psychological PPE. We need to make sure that we start to look after, protect, support all NHS staff, because we've just seen the figures on recruitment and retention, and it's so important that we start somewhere, and actually providing every single health worker with a space and time to reflect, to be together, to come together. It's sort of barn door obvious. And most people think, well, doesn't this happen anyway? If you're a nurse and you're having to deal with a ward and patient dying, or you're a paediatrician and having to tell parents that their baby's very, very unsick, that there aren't spaces where we can talk about that. But there isn't. And what we're calling for is that this becomes part and parcel of our contractual arrangement, that it's there for us to pick up without having to ask for it.
Psychological PPE, that's a great phrase, and one which I am about to steal. Dame Claire Gerada, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, and thank you for all your hard work as well.
Oh, cheers. I'll take that. Thank you. Welcome back. COVID restrictions in Wales are being eased from today. Nightclubs can reopen, while social distancing and the rule of 6 have been scrapped for outdoor hospitality. Self-isolation rules are also being brought in line with those in England. Joining us now, the Welsh Economy Minister, Von Gething. Mr Gething, great to have you on the programme this morning. Shall we start with COVID isolation, bringing it down to a minimum of 5 days, coming in line with that in England and Northern Ireland? Were you perhaps isolating for too long before now?
Well, we were waiting for the up-to-date advice from Public Health Wales. So the Health Minister had advice that came in recently, that came to the Chief Medical Officer. We discussed it in Cabinet just last week, actually, that the advice was imminent. That advice has now come through and we've made an announcement. So it's acting on the advice that we have, look at the data and the evidence we have, and that's why we've made the decision. So it's 5 full days with a negative test on day 5 and then a negative test on day 6, which is common with the rest of the UK.
So from Friday, nightclubs set to reopen. The rules limiting numbers gathering in pubs and restaurants scrapped. Social distancing comes to an end, and all just in time for the Six Nations. Can you give us an idea of just how badly hospitality has been hit in Wales as a result of the restrictions?
I've had direct conversations with people in hospitality, the visitor economy, and I know it's been very, very difficult for them. And the difficulties, of course, England took a very different approach. We had advice, very clear public health advice, that we needed to act. And that's why we did so. I know that some people have been fearful for their businesses, been worried about whether this really would come to an end as quickly as we said it was likely to. And I think actually a few weeks ago, hospitality were expecting that the restrictions would carry on further than they are now, because of the response of people in Wales who want to bring those restrictions to an end. And interestingly, I think there is a good deal more optimism in the sector. They're looking forward to trading, but the economic support we provided, the financial support, we're actually encouraging people to take it up because we haven't seen the level take it we thought we would do, which is, I think, because people are looking forward to trading and just want to get on with it. So I'm optimistic about the future. We made great efforts to get to this place, and as a result of all of our efforts, fewer people have come to harm. We're going to have more optimism at staying out of restrictions and further measures in the future.
What, though, of those methods by which the Welsh approach to dealing with COVID now does actually differentiate from that in England? Face masks and COVID passes, do those remain under review, or do you perhaps see those as being necessary for longer than just another few weeks?
No, we review all of our measures on a 3-weekly cycle. So actually the next time we're reviewing everything is on the 10th of February. And we'll continue to review measures every 3 weeks to see if they're still necessary or proportionate. So you will still need to wear a face covering if you're going into a shop or going onto public transport, for example. That is different to England. We still think that's the right thing. COVID rates in Wales are about 500 and 100,000. So not low, but actually that's nearly half of the rates in England. And I think that just highlights a very different risk appetite between ministers, look at the public health advice on whether we think it's the right thing to do to have these quite light touch measures, but we think they still matter and make a difference to keep people safe and keep all of this activity open.
Some, however, might not describe COVID passes as in any way a light touch. Just in terms of the kind of the philosophical underpinning of the policy, I mean, is it your intention to remove the requirement for COVID passes at some point in the future?
Yes, I'm very keen that we move to a position where we don't have any measures or restrictions in place. But what we need to do is to take those steps at a proportionate time. It's why we take seriously the public health advice, the scientific advice we get. We have a review on the 10th of February. If we still have the same measures, then we'll review all the measures again in 3 weeks' time after that. So it's regular review. And I can assure you, ministers in the Welsh Government are very keen not to have to talk about additional measures and protections in place to reduce the harm from COVID and to get on with the business of rebuilding the Welsh economy. We have significant challenges, not just pandemic recovery, new relationships with Europe, but also new opportunities, I think, as well. So I'm much keener to come back on this programme to talk about what we're doing to rebuild jobs and prosperity here in Wales.
Vaughan Gething, great to have you on the programme. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.